Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. In the history of civil rights, there are certain moments that just completely redefine the future. Today, we're exploring one of those moments, the fight for Alaska Native rights, which is really anchored by the incredible story of a woman named Elizabeth Peratrovich. We're going to look at her absolutely fearless stand against systemic discrimination, and then see how that initial spark evolved into this massive, decades-long struggle over ancestral lands. It's a legacy that quite literally shapes modern Alaska. Picture this. You're standing on the floor of a highly charged legislative session, and you deliver these exact raw words to lawmakers. Men who, by the way, regularly boasted about having thousands of years of recorded civilization behind them. This was Elizabeth Peratkovich's response to the deep-seated prejudice of the time. She took their own degrading narrative and just totally flipped it on its head, to call out the staggering hypocrisy of the very people tasked with upholding the Constitution. It's incredibly powerful. The environment in that anti-discrimination hearing must have been absolutely electric. Peratrovich wasn't just up there having a polite debate. She was painstakingly explaining to a room full of very powerful politicians the brutal, systemic segregation that made her testimony necessary in the first place. She was taking on a deeply ingrained culture of Jim Crow in Alaska, head-on. To really understand the weight of her testimony, we have to understand her daily reality. When Elizabeth and her husband moved to Juneau, they were denied a lease in a nice neighborhood for one reason: because they were Indian. And it didn't stop there. Doors to schools were just flat out closed to Native children. Businesses actually hung signs out front stating that Natives, and dogs, mind you, were not allowed. They were routinely turned away from hotels and restaurants. That was the daily indignity they were living with. What is truly mind-blowing about her testimony is how she broke down the anatomy of discrimination into this devastatingly accurate sociological framework. She laid it out in 3 steps. First, you have the politician, who purposely maintains an inferior minority group, just so they have someone to make easy promises to. Second, you have everyday people. She called them Mr. and Mrs. Jones, who are so insecure about their own social standing that their kindness is completely conditional on who's watching. And finally, the white supremacist, who just fundamentally believes in racial superiority. During the same hearing, a Senator Shottuck tried to challenge her. He basically asked, well, is passing this anti-discrimination bill actually going to end discrimination? And her response was brilliantly logical. She countered by asking if passing laws against larceny or murder had eliminated those crimes. Obviously not, right? Her point was that while no law eliminates crime entirely, passing the bill is how legislators boldly assert to the world that they recognize an evil and fully intend to overcome it. So her civil rights victory was this massive history-making catalyst. But it naturally brings up a really critical question. What did the Native protests look like from that point forward? Because this momentum for basic human dignity didn't just stop. It evolved. It grew to tackle another massive looming crisis, which was systemic land theft and the issue of unresolved Indigenous territory. Now, Elizabeth wasn't doing this all on her own. She was part of a broader, rapidly growing movement. You had figures like William L. Powell fighting intense political battles for Native rights. You had everyday citizens stepping up too, like a really brave young girl in Nome who protested segregation at the local Dream Theater. Add to that the fact that World War II was fundamentally altering perspectives and opening up new opportunities. The whole environment was shifting, and this powerful collective voice was rising up across the state. Let's track how this snowballed. You see, unlike the lower 48 states where Native lands were largely taken through treaties and violent displacement, Alaska's story was different. Up until the mid-1930s, the federal government pretty much just ignored Alaskan Native title altogether. The first real attempts to reconcile who owned what didn't start until the 1950s. And then, a major tipping point. The 1958 Statehood Act willfully ignored Native rights, which triggered a federal land freeze. This essentially supercharged the Indigenous claims movement all the way until 1971. Which brings us to the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971, often called INSA. This was a game changer. This legislation formally extinguished Aboriginal title in exchange for letting Alaska Natives keep some of their land, plus a payout of financial compensation. To manage all of this, the act set up a really unique corporate model. 12 profit-making regional corporations and roughly 239 village corporations. To truly grasp the scale of ANSISA, which, by the way, was the largest Indigenous land claim settlement in U.S. history at the time, we have to look at the hard numbers. The federal government provided $1 billion in financial compensation to Alaska Natives. That is a massive sum, especially in 1971. Alongside that $1 billion, there was the land retention piece of the puzzle. Under the Act, Alaska Natives retained ownership of 44 million acres of land spread across the state. And again, this land was to be owned and managed by those newly formed regional and village corporations we just talked about. But here is the stark contrast. To secure that $1 billion and those 44 million acres, Alaska Natives had to legally give up their claim to the rest of their ancestral homeland. We're talking about relinquishing 380.5 million acres. If you do the math on that, it means they gave up that territory for less than $3 an acre. Less than $3. It was a staggering trade-off, and one that absolutely defined the modern era for Indigenous Alaskans. So, once this huge deal was struck, the state was effectively partitioned up for corporate management. Regional entities took charge of their respective areas. Take the Sealaska Corporation, operating in the southeast, for example. As a for-profit entity, their mandate was to manage these lands and invest in industries like fishing and timber, specifically to generate profits for their Indigenous shareholders, who are the tribal members enrolled in the corporation. You can literally see the impact of that corporate structure today at massive shareholder gatherings. But here's the thing, the legacy of ANCSA isn't just about balance sheets and corporate profits. It is deeply tied to cultural survival. Corporations like Sealaska eventually created nonprofit branches, like the Sealaska Heritage Institute, whose entire mission is to actively perpetuate and celebrate the rich traditions of the Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian cultures. As we wrap up this explainer, we've essentially traced a line from Elizabeth Petrovich's absolute refusal to accept a second-class existence all the way to a multi-billion-dollar settlement that forever reshaped an entire state. Her words changed history, plain and simple, because she refused to stay silent in the face of injustice. So, looking back at the profound, unapologetic courage of the civil rights era, I want to leave you with this. What issue is worth standing up for today? Thank you so much for exploring this vital piece of history with us.